Hey, who's Strixie in our group chat? Is that John? Oh, okay. Thought so.
Okay, I'll speak about you. I have a note. This is
Don't pay attention.
Dr. Baltimore Oliveira. Dr. Oliveira is a Filipino.
Wait, Patrick. Wait, Patrick. Thank you.
You're a Filipino chemist. And just note that a study showed that from the University of Buffalo showed that Filipino students are 60% less likely to major in STEM fields. Dr. Oliveira, being a native of the Philippines, has done a lot when it comes to neuroscience while we're studying the brain. So he discovered that the toxins that come from cone snails, which are native to the Philippines, are actually important for neuroscience. He's established a whole branch of study called conotoxin research. The conotoxins are the poisons that come from the cone snails. If you got stung by a cone snail, you would be paralyzed. But the conotoxins themselves have allowed for a lot of discoveries and findings when it comes to neuroscience. For instance, it led to a lot of breakthroughs when it comes to the studying of the neuromuscular junction and what's happening at that synaptic cleft. By studying conotoxins and their effects on muscles. Besides establishing this whole branch of research, the conotoxins, Dr. Oliveira also discovered the enzyme from E. coli called DNA ligase. Anyone know what DNA ligase is?
It's odd. Ligase is isn't it like enzymes?
It is an enzyme, so DNA ligase participates in the process of DNA replication. DNA ligase can take two pieces of DNA and ligate them together. Ligate means to glue them together. So DNA ligase is a protein, is an enzyme that he discovered in E. coli, the bacteria. And besides E. coli having that enzyme, we have our own human DNA ligase that is necessary during DNA replication to glue pieces of DNA together as strands of DNA are being copied. We also harness this enzyme in the laboratory in tubes when we are working with pieces of DNA and want to glue them together to make longer strands of DNA sequences. So he is credited with discovering that enzyme. And he currently is a professor of biology at the University of Utah, Dr. Oliveira. Okay, we're going to head into the spinal cord. Take a trip through the spinal cord. Nice cross section through the spinal cord. And this is continuing in the central nervous system, through the brain and the spinal cord makes a central nervous system. They integrate and their jobs together. They're processing information that's coming into the central nervous system. It's sent up the spinal cord. The brain thinks about it, and then sends out motor commands that head out the spinal cord at spinal nerves. But not only the brain can think about things and then cause motor commands to be sent out, that can happen at the spinal cord as well. And when that happens quickly at the spinal cord, instead of traveling all the way up to the brain, we call those then reactions or motor movements in response to the spinal cord, causing them reflexes. So you ever been to the doctor, you had your knee hit and your leg kicks out? That's a reflex that the spinal cord is handling. It doesn't go up to the brain. Sometimes we don't have time to think about it. We need to have a reflex right away. So the spinal cord handles reflexes, especially those in response to danger or something, okay? Gotta think lickety split, bad things happen. So they work together, but they function independently of one another, the spinal cord and the brain. And again, the spinal cord allows this two-way highway, bringing afferent or sensory information in, afferent with the A, into the central nervous system, and then efferent with an E, exiting the central nervous system, efferent and E. Those fibers are sending out motor commands. It's all traveling up and down the spinal cord, heading up to the brain stem, or down from the brain stem, and up to the brain, or down from the brain, and definitely traveling to the spinal cord. There are two spinal nerves that exit there. Lab C will learn tonight that not all nerves exit all the way down at the spinal cord. We're gonna meet the cranial nerves that exit at the brain stem. So we have this two-way highway for sensory information to come in and motor commands to come out, and then coordinating both of these, sensory and motor, at the spinal cord itself makes for a reflex. So the spinal cord is divided into its regions according to the vertebrae that surround it. The spinal cord itself is 45 centimeters on average. It does not grow as long as we grow tall. So eventually, something's gonna have to take over at the regions, lower regions of the body that the spinal cord doesn't reach. We'll see what that is. It has a couple of bulging regions, its cervical and its lumbar regions. They're kind of bulgy, and it has to pass through foramen magnum, but it's going to end at some, at L1 and L2. Some lumbar vertebrae. It doesn't extend all the way down. So here we are at the spinal cord, passing through the vertebral foramen of each vertebrae. Then when we stack those vertebrae up, makes the column through which the spinal cord is traveling. So we see at the spinal cord, spinal nerves that will exit. They will exit through the foramen that are made, the intervertebral foramen that are made on the sides of the vertebrae as they stack on top of each other. They not only make a canal through the center of them, but on their sides, they make foramen between them as they stack on top of each other. Those are the intervertebral foramen through which the spinal nerves will exit the spinal cord and head out to go innervate the muscles of the body at whatever level, leaving the spinal cord, or to bring in sensory information from the body at whatever level that's handled by the spinal cord. It has a couple of enlarged areas, the cervical enlargement, you can tell the difference, kind of that's that bulging area, then the lumbosacral enlargement as well. And that's because these regions are responsible for the limbs. So not only the thoracic cavity, but the limbs as well. So you get a bulge in this region. And then lower where the legs are, you get a bulge in the spinal cord because now we have to handle the legs. So we're gonna get to the cervical nerves that are grouped in plexuses next time. We'll talk about the different plexuses that are groups of spinal nerves. But here we can see the cervical enlargement and then the spinal nerves that make up a particular plexus that we're gonna be responsible for learning, the brachial plexus, and all will then group out into the nerves that break out to the nerves that innervate all the way down to our fingers. So here we are in the spinal cord. and its enlargements that make for the nerves that are gonna handle the limbs. The very tip of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris. That is the tip, tapered in, the tip of the spinal cord. And again, that happens at L1 to L2. It doesn't even go all the way down to L5 or nor to the sacrum, So it stops again shorter than we are tall, okay? And so what takes over are just a whole band of spinal nerves that look like a horse's tail. Therefore, it's called the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. A lot of mixed nerves that are originating right at the conus medullaris that then go out and extend down, and they will innervate the lower regions of the body, take over from what the spinal cord is unable to reach. These, I think of the nerve. Sciatic nerve is a part of the cauda equina. Made that. So we have a lot of nerves that will make the cauda equina. From L2 to L5, it's going to be different in some people, and including S1 to S5. Okay, these nerves. Again, the nerves are numbered and labeled and numbered for the way we would do the vertebrae. At the vertebrae that they exit. At the very tip of the spinal cord, we have this fibrous connective tissue cord that extends, called the filum terminale. This, again, extends from the conus medullaris, the very tip or end of the spinal cord, and it extends all the way to the coccyx bone and inserts there, okay? And it's covered with pia mater. This is the anchor of the spinal cord to the bone so that the spinal cord can't move up and down. So it kind of anchors it so it can't move. Okay. So it prevents it moving longitudinally, or it stabilizes it longitudinally so it cannot move up and down. So this green represents that filum terminale that anchors the spinal cord to the bone, the coccyx bone. And all the yellow is for the conus medullaris. And then we can see here all the spinal nerves, the conus medullaris. And, the cauda equina extends from the conus medullaris. And here some places the filum terminale that anchors the spinal cord to the bone, the very bottom, so it can't move up and down. The spinal cord has wrapped around it its meninges. They've just been cut away in some regions, but the spinal cord is wrapped with meninges as well, just like the brain. Here is the spinal cord. There is the conus medullaris, its tip, and here's the filum terminale that will anchor it to the coccyx bone so it can move up and down. Here is the meninges that have been opened up so we can see inside the spinal cord. And again, inside of here, all closed up, will be cerebrospinal fluid that's flowing over the surface of the spinal cord. Here's the cauda equina, the long spinal nerves that will go on down to continue the work that the spinal cord is too short to do. We'll see the flat green guy for a lot of stuff when it comes to the spinal cord because it is there. And we'll even see the conus medullaris, the filum terminale, and the cauda equina. Close, there's the conus medullaris, the tip of the spinal cord. Its meninges are doing the same thing for it that they do for the brain. We have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater, providing protection, absorbing shock, making it buoyant in that cerebrospinal fluid. Here, we do have an epidural space. For in the brain, we don't have that because the meninges, the dura mater, is attached to the skull. So there's no space above the dura mater when it comes to at the brain, right? So you don't want to be bleeding right there, else you'll rip that layer from away from the bone. But here we do have an epidural space, and it's actually filled with fat. It's a nice cushion of fat there, blood vessels run there, and this epidural space that we do have at the spinal cord, but not at the skull or the brain. Again, cerebral spinal fluid is flowing through the subarachnoid space, okay, below the arachnoid mater. And the dura mater, arachnoid mater, goes all the way to the sacrum, even beyond the end of the spinal cord. So the meninges are like one big bag with the with the brain and spinal cord in it, filled with cerebral spinal fluid. Spinal cord, we have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and then if you touch the actual spinal cord below these maters, then you're touching the pia mater. Here are the dura mater still wrapped around the spinal cord, encasing the spinal cord. Open it up, and then we'll see the arachnoid mater. Below that, touching the actual spinal cord, you'll be touching the pia mater that runs the contours of the spinal cord. So the dura mater, pull that away, we'll see the arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater. This is comparable to our model, not doing its best. Our model does its best. This is a pretty good model, so we're thinking out pictures of it for us. Here's that the epidural, the epidural space. So here's the dura mater. Here's the epidural space filled with fat. And then we have the arachnoid mater below the dura mater, and then we have the subarachnoid space filled with cerebral spinal fluid, bathing the pia mater, that surface, that's lining the surface of the spinal cord. And this is the vertebrae surrounding the spinal cord, so this is that vertebral foramen through which the spinal cord is traveling. So the spinal cord, again, has that filum terminal that anchors into the coxicone, so it can't move up and down, but it also has these denticulate ligaments that anchor it laterally so that it can't move side to side. And it anchors, these are extensions of the pia mater that will then anchor to the dura mater, okay, to help the spinal cord be unable to move from side to side. We don't want our spinal cord moving at all. The denticular ligaments, again, are bits of pia mater that anchor all the way through the arachnoid mater to the dura mater. There's a denticular ligament. Cut things away, we can still see some denticular ligaments. On our model, the flat green eye, the denticular ligaments are indicated. Anchoring the spinal cord laterally to the dura mater. Let's take a cross section through the spinal cord and see what we see. We're going to see the organization of the white matter and the gray matter here. You can see denticular ligaments here on this picture. Again, there's that epidural space filled with fat. Before we get to the dura mater, then the arachnoid mater, and the subarachnoid space. The pia mater is at the spinal cord itself. When we do cross sections at different levels of the spinal cord, we get different patterns, and that helps with knowing what section of the spinal cord you have if you learn these patterns well. So every section of the spinal cord has its own patterning, even all the way down to at the sacral region. Here we go. We're getting close to the sacral region. white shows up darker than gray matter. Gray matter inside. So the gray matter of the spinal cord is at the center. And then we have white matter around it, and then that's it. At the brain, we have gray matter at the center, organized as basal nuclei, caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus. That gray matter organized in pairs, surrounded by white matter, the axons of neurons that are running, whichever way. Surrounded in the cortex of the brain, surrounded by more gray matter. We have an additional layer of gray matter at the brain called the cortex. Here, we do not have that. We have a center region of gray matter surrounded by white matter. The gray matter is the cell bodies of neurons, okay? Still in the central nervous system, so we still call those groups of neurons the cell bodies, nuclei. And those neurons can be sensory or motor. So they're sensory and motor nuclei in that sense. That gray matter is surrounded by white matter, which are the tracks, or tracks of fibers, or tracks of axons. Fibers and axons are interchangeable, okay? And they run in tracks. And we're gonna see those tracks as columns of white matter at the spinal cord. We have ascending tracks that when we head up, bringing in sensory information, and descending tracks are heading down and out, sending out motor commands. So here we are at this model, the center gray region, okay, gray matter, surrounded by white matter. And then we have a couple of grooves at the spinal cord. We have the ventral median fissure and the dorsal median sulcus. These divide the spinal cord into right and left halves. See that? So interior is the ventral median sulcus fissure, which we can also either call ventral or anterior median fissure. And we can either call it the dorsal or posterior median sulcus. Then running through the center of the spinal cord is a canal. The central canal runs longitudinally through the center of the spinal cord, filled with ependymal cells, making cerebral spinal fluid inside of the central canal. So here we see the central canal of the spinal cord lined with ependymal cells. They are making cerebrospinal fluid and secreting it into that central canal, so that that region of the spinal cord gets nice and bathed by cerebrospinal fluid. So here is that central canal of the spinal cord. It's surrounded by gray matter. Here is the anterior or ventral median fissure and the posterior or dorsal median sulcus. And fissure a little more pronounced than a sulcus. Divides the spinal cord into right and left halves. The gray matter is organized into structures that we call horns. So it's the dorsal gray horns and the ventral gray horns. The dorsal gray horns are different from the ventral gray horns because the dorsal gray horns consist of groups of cell bodies of neurons, nuclei, that are receiving sensory input from the body, somatic, and from the organs, visceral. The dorsal gray horns are where sensory information is coming in along those axons of those fibers whose cell bodies are in the dorsal gray horns. The ventral gray horns consist of cell bodies of neurons whose axons are sending out motor commands. Okay, so the ventral gray horns that are in the front, they are anterior, they are all about motor commands headed out. Compared to the dorsal gray horns, those neurons there are all about sensory information coming in. Then we have some lateral gray horns. These are devoted to visceral motor commands going out specifically via the sympathetic nervous system, okay, which is our fight or flight nervous system, okay, making us get ready to fight or run when it comes to danger. Then there's a region of connecting both sides of the spinal cord. It's called the gray commissure. Although it's composed of axons running laterally from side to side, connecting both halves of the spinal cord. So note that it's called the gray commissure, but it consists of axons, okay? Not cell bodies of neurons, but axons connecting the gray matter on both sides of the central canal. Here's the central canal. Here's gray matter on both sides of the central canal. Here's the gray commissure. It has a posterior and an anterior portion. We're going to call all of this the gray commissure as a whole, with the central canal running through. Axons running back and side to side, connecting the right and left side of the spinal cord. Here's the posterior or dorsal gray horn. All about cell bodies here of neurons are receiving sensory information coming in from the periphery. Everything outside of the spinal cord is the periphery. Peripheral nervous system is bringing in information to the spinal cord via sensory input. The anterior gray horn, or the ventral gray horn, is all about cell bodies of neurons whose axons are headed out to go send out motor commands. Here we are. Nice cross-section slide of the spinal cord, the central canal, the gray commissure, connecting the gray matter on the right and left sides. The gray matter is organized into a dorsal gray horn, posterior gray horn, and the ventral gray horn, anterior gray horn, and a lateral gray horn, devoted to organs and the sympathetic control of the sympathetic nervous system control of organs. Sensory input coming in, motor commands going out. All right, again, looking at the model. Gray commissure, central canal, gray matter organized into horns, dorsal horns, cell bodies here, whose axons are bringing in sensory information. Lateral horn, cell bodies here, whose axons are controlling the viscera, headed out to the viscera, the organs. Ventral, I hear you, that's good. I hear you loud and clear. Then the ventral horn. Okay, cell bodies here are, their axons are sending out motor commands. And then we have the white matter. The white matter is going to be organized in columns, not horns, but columns. Nice cross section through the cervical region of the spinal cord, the thoracic region of the spinal cord, the lumbar region of the spinal cord. So when it comes again to the gray matter, those dorsal roots, these are axons from sensory neurons. Okay? The sensory neurons are in a special place. So we have the sensory neurons in the spinal cord at the dorsal horn. But there's going to be a set of neurons before we get to the dorsal horn that there's a group of cell bodies of neurons in the periphery. Now we're changing the name of a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system, that's called a nucleus. In the peripheral nervous system, that's called a ganglion. Okay? So at the spinal cord, or next to the spinal cord, we leave the central nervous system and we're right at the peripheral nervous system. And there we're going to see a ganglion called the dorsal root ganglion. Here we're going to see cell bodies of neurons that will deliver sensory information into the dorsal gray horn of the spinal cord. Okay. the axons of these neurons whose cell bodies are in the dorsal root ganglia next door to the spinal cord. Their axons make the dorsal root. These neurons have receptors for sensation out in the periphery, picking up touch, vision, hearing, whatever the sensation is. And all that sensory information is traveling as electrical impulses on those axons of the neurons whose cell bodies are in the dorsal root ganglia. And then they deliver this sensory input, or they innervate the neurons whose cell bodies are in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, meaning they release neurotransmitter at these neurons who are in the dorsal horn. Innervating means this guy's releasing a neurotransmitter that's going to bind to the next neuron. So the neurons in the dorsal root ganglia release neurotransmitter at the neurons in the dorsal horn. And in that sense, they're passing the nerve impulse, the electrical impulse, to each other from one set of neurons to the next, to carry that sensory input into the central nervous system, for the brain to figure out what to do in response to that sensation. Or the spinal cord figures it out right there and calls a reflex. Some kind of quick muscle movement that we call a reflex. The ventral roots are, well, a collection of rootlets, and we'll see this, so make more sense when we see a picture. These are just a collection of the axons for motor neurons, okay, whose cell bodies are in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, okay, and then their axons weave as a collection of rootlets along what's called the ventral root. No ganglion when it comes to the motor control. Only a ganglion when it comes to sensory information coming in. And along these roots, we're taking motor commands out of the central nervous system into the periphery where there's muscles that need to get innervated. At the neuromuscular junctions, we know what happens there. At some point, the dorsal roots of axons coming in and the ventral roots, axons going out, are going to converge. And where they converge, we call that a mixed spinal nerve, or just a spinal nerve. Knowing that a spinal nerve is both motor coming out, those axons, and sensory coming in, they mix. They make a spinal nerve. And those at the spinal nerve, we are leaving at the vertebrae through the intervertebral foramen. Those are the holes on the sides of the vertebrae that are made as one vertebrae stacks on the other. They make foramen between them. All right, let's see some of this stuff. Make it make sense. So here is the dorsal root ganglion. It's a bulb, and we have all these bulbs lining the spinal cord, right there, kind of between the vertebrae and the spinal cord. We have these bulbs on at every level. Those bulbs are the dorsal root ganglion. These are where we find the cell bodies of neurons. We are in the peripheral nervous system here. So we call this group of cell bodies of neurons a ganglion, the dorsal root ganglion. These neurons have brought in sensory information from the periphery. Then their axons make up what's called the dorsal root. It's all these, then they branch into these dorsal rootlets. And those enter the spinal cord. Now we're in the central nervous system. And we're gonna deliver information about sensation that happened out here in the body, in the periphery somewhere, to the dorsal root, the dorsal gray horn of the spinal cord. So we went from the peripheral nervous system right into the central nervous system, delivering sensory information along the axons of these neurons whose cell bodies are in the dorsal root ganglion. And then the neurons here at the ventral gray horn, their cell bodies are here in the spinal cord. but their axons travel out on these ventral rootlets that merge to form the ventral root. And these send out motor commands to muscles in the periphery. At some point, we're gonna have a merger between sensory coming in, sensory fibers coming in, and motor fibers going out. That merger is what we call the spinal nerve. And it's a short, not long, it's really quick. You get some spinal nerve. It's then gonna do some branching. Here are our dorsal rootlets. If it's sensory coming in, those dorsal rootlets are going into the dorsal gray horn. These are axons. If it's motor coming out, then these are axons that are going to send out motor commands. And the peripheral nervous system that's right outside of the central nervous system will have bulbs, these dorsal root ganglia, where we have cell bodies of neurons who are devoted to bringing in sensory information from the periphery and carrying it into the dorsal root of the spinal cord. Then that information will either be considered there, and the spinal cord will cause some reflex, or that information will go all the way up, ascend the central nervous system to the brain, to the thalamus, that will then relay that sensory information along projection fibers to wherever it needs to go in the brain to be figured out. And the brain will send out motor commands that will travel all the way down to the brain stem, through the dorsal horn, the ventral horn of the spinal cord. And then that information will exit along axons between the dorsal rootlets and the dorsal root as motor commands going to work some muscles somewhere.
So there doesn't have to be dendrites to receive the information, actual cell bodies to receive the information?
The cell bodies have their dendrites.
Okay.
The cell bodies have their dendrites,
Okay.
yes. Good question. Okie dokie. So, what do we have here? We have the ventral horn. Cell bodies here devoted to sending out motor commands. Their axons leave along the ventral root. There's a whole bunch of ventral rootlets coming together. The dorsal roots are a whole bunch of dorsal rootlets. These are axons of neurons that are bringing in information to the dorsal horn, sensory information to the dorsal horn. The cell bodies of these neurons are at that bulge out here, that dorsal root ganglion. Okay, that's dorsal root ganglion. Calling it a ganglia because it's a part of the peripheral nervous system, even though it's right next door to the spinal cord. It is not a part of the central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system. These are cell bodies of neurons that are receiving sensory impulses from their receptors out in the periphery. Bringing all of that in to the central nervous system, specifically to that dorsal gray horn of the spinal cord. So here we just see these roots. Here are ganglia. The cell bodies are here. This is the peripheral nervous system. And here the dura mater is open. The ganglion are not enclosed in dura mater. Only the spinal cord is. They are outside of the dura mater. It's just the dura mater is open here so we can see the spinal cord. But in the dorsal root ganglia, these bulbs that line both sides of the spinal cord are cell bodies of neurons whose receptors are out here in the periphery picking up sensation. That sensation travels along the extension that's bringing that information into the cell body, the long dendrite with a receptor at the end. Bringing it, this could be a bipolar neuron, which participates in sensory information, transmitting sensory information. And bringing in that information to the cell body. And then we'll deliver that information along the axons into the central nervous system at the dorsal horn. Good question. Explain how sensory information travels from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system and the spinal cord. Explain how, explain how sensory information is brought in from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system at the spinal cord. Explain how motor commands are sent out from the central nervous system into the periphery at the spinal cord. And there you're telling me every structure that's doing whatever it has to do is a part of this process. For instance, cell bodies of neurons are found in the dorsal root ganglion. Their receptors are way out here in the periphery, picking up some sensation. That sensation travels along, most likely a long dendrite, and bringing that into the cell body that's here at the dorsal root ganglion, still in the periphery here. Now we're going to enter into, along the dorsal root, those impulses are traveling. Now we're traveling along axons. Travel into now the central nervous system, and deliver that information or those nerve impulses or release neurotransmitter at the neurons here, whose cell bodies are here in the ventral, the dorsal horn. Delivered passing these impulses is releasing neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft between this neuron coming in and this axon terminus is right there at the cell body of some neuron who's in here. There's a synaptic cleft in between them. Neurotransmitter secreted. Doesn't have to be acetylcholine, it could be a different type of neurotransmitter. And then that impulse continues to travel on up. Ganglia are neuronal cell bodies grouped together in the peripheral nervous system. Homologous, or the same as a nuclei in the central nervous system. So here we would have nuclei. Out here we have ganglia. Ganglia. Peripheral nervous system, right next to the central nervous system, but peripheral nervous system. Ganglia lining at every level of the spinal cord. Ganglia. Dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal roots, axons, bringing in information to the dorsal horn. Now we're in the central nervous system. Peripheral, central. Ganglions. Ganglion. Ganglion even more magnified. Now we're starting to see the cell bodies of the neurons here. Now we can see them even better. Cell bodies of neurons. Waiting to get that sensory information. Come on in, because we got to go deliver that into the spinal cord. Beautiful fluorescence microscopy of the cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion. The soma, another word for cell body. The somas of the neurons in the dorsal root ganglion. And we even see the nuclei of some glial cells. This is the peripheral nervous system. The only glial cells, the helper cells, helping the neurons, are either Schwann cells, wrapping around the axons, making myelin sheath, or satellite cells, wrapping around the cell bodies, taking care of the neurons. Only two ganglia or glial cells in the the peripheral nervous system. The rest of them are in the central nervous system. Both of them start with S. I help you to learn, not memorize, learn. Satellite Schwann, out in the periphery. You know what they do? Taking care, satellites are taking care of these folks, these neurons, wrapping themselves around their cell bodies. Beautiful fluorescence microscopy of the cell bodies, dorsal root ganglion. So, we have a receptor out in the periphery. Okay, this is like maybe a pseudo unipolar neuron who has one extension that's divided into two, okay? Or it's like a T, okay? At one end of this extension is a receptor in the periphery, picking up some sensation that travels along that extension as a nerve impulse, electrical impulse, that's jumping from what kind of node to what kind of node? The node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier, right? And it's being insulated by the myelin sheath. It's not just flittering away to the on back, or else we won't be able to feel it or sense whatever the sensation is. So that impulse is traveling, and it then gets to the cell body of this pseudo-unipolar neuron. Then continues to travel. It's going to build up at that axon hillock and then travel. Now we're along the dorsal root, headed into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord to deliver or to secrete neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft at neurons whose cell bodies are now in the nuclei inside of the central nervous system here at the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Dorsal root ganglion. Again, they are outside of the dura mater because they are not a part of the central nervous system. The white matter. We have nerve fibers, axons, that are either myelinated or non-myelinated. Again, they are allowing communication between the spinal cord, different regions of the spinal cord, all the way up to the brain, and the brain stem up to the brain. We call the white matter organization, or they're organized as columns in the spinal cord. Those can be called funiculi. A funiculus is a column. And we have columns of tracts. Those tracts can be called fascicles. So we have columns of tracts of axons. A whole bunch of axons make a tract. A whole bunch of tracts make a column. And those columns, a whole bunch of axons running in tracts, consist of fibers, axons, that are bringing sensory input in and up the central nervous system, and sending motor commands out and down and out of the central nervous system, either heading down to lower levels of the spinal cord, heading down to lower levels of the spinal cord from the brain. And then we have the fibers that are running from side to side. Okay? The white matter fibers run side to side via transverse tracts, commissural fibers, and like the gray commissure between both sides of the spinal cord. The white matter is divided into three columns: the dorsal, lateral, and ventral columns. And then again, those tracts that come together to make columns are composed of axons. And those axons are going usually to the same place, running on the same track to go do the same thing. So here is how we organize the white matter. Okay. And also we have an organization that is for some reason superimposed on the gray matter, but it's for the white matter. With that said, all the way back to the gray matter and look at, before I go on to that white matter, its organization. So the gray matter is also organized the same in the way that the columns of the white matter is organized. So back to the gray matter, to our ventral and dorsal horns. Ventral and dorsal horns. Note that each horn, both horns, is divided into a nucleus devoted where we have cell bodies in the central nervous system. So this is the nucleus, cell bodies of neurons that are devoted to the bringing in sensory information from the body. And then we have a nucleus, cell bodies of neurons, who are devoted to bringing in sensory information from the viscera or the organs. And then in the ventral horn, we have cell bodies devoted to sending out motor commands to the body, as well as motor commands to the organs. This is how the gray matter is organized, either for the body, sensation from the body or the organs, or motor commands out to the body or to the organs. The white matter is its own personal organization. Via the different parts of the body that these tracts are devoted to. So we have, this is posterior, so this is the dorsal, so we have sensation coming in. So this is all devoted to our, it can be a motor or sensory, devoted to the different parts of the body, organized along tracts of white matter. So it's just a map of where these axons are either bringing sensory information in or sending motor commands out. On a model, this region would be composed of the columns. So white matter here running in columns, white matter in the dorsal columns, the ventral white columns, and then we have the lateral white columns as well. If one suffered from some type of spinal cord trauma, you could either have paresthesias, that's not how you say it, paresthesias, which is where we have a loss of sensation. So there's some damage to the parts of the spinal cord that are about receiving sensory information that are causing a loss of sensation or paralysis. Now we're damaging the motor fibers coming at the spinal cord. That's a loss of motor function. Okay? So you can have flaccid paralysis or spastic paralysis. Flaccid paralysis because we have some severe damage to that ventral root or the ventral horn. So the muscles aren't receiving their impulses, okay, for muscle movement. Spastic paralysis is due to damage at higher motor neurons that are higher up in the cortex of the brain. Okay. Now we are damaging the neurons that are both for muscle control and the spinal cord's job promoting reflexes, which is quick muscle control without even thinking at the brain. So either way, we're damaging muscle control by these these different types of spinal cord traumas, either damaging the ability to sense or to move muscle. You can also have a trauma that causes a transection, so a straight cross section through the spinal cord. And depending on where that happens will determine on what motor movement is lost. If we're between T1 and L1, then we can be a paraplegic, where you'll just be unable to move the upper body, muscles of the upper body, or quadriplegic in the cervical region will cause, paraplegic. You won't be able to move your lower body. Okay, but if you have damage at the cervical region, you won't be able to move the upper or the lower, depending on where cross section happens. Then we have our spinal nerves. Again, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Named for where they are leaving the spinal cord. These are all responsible for the body, every place in the body except the head and the neck, which is governed by the cranial nerves, not the big spinal nerves. These are all named for the vertebrae that they're associated with. So we have 7 cervical vertebrae, but 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, because C1, which is mid spinal nerve C1, exits above C1, the vertebrae. Okay, then the rest come out out of the intervertebral foramen. They all are exiting the intervertebral foramen, which are the holes that are made, the foramen that are made when one vertebrae stacks on the other. These are foramen that run down the sides of the vertebral column. And again, the mixed spinal nerve is where the dorsal roots meet up with the ventral roots. And this happens with the ganglia, the spinal cord is here, then you have your ganglion here, the spinal nerve will be after that ganglion. Okay, so below the dorsal root ganglion, and it's very short, a centimeter in length. So here we are, there's that dorsal root, the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Here's the dorsal root ganglion, cell bodies, neurons here who have extensions going out into the periphery, and bringing in sensory information. And then at the ventral horn, we have cell bodies here whose axons are traveling out, carrying out motor commands. Where those 2 sets of axons meet is the spinal nerve, the big spinal nerve. That's below the dorsal root ganglion. So big spinal nerve will be right here. There's the dorsal root ganglion, the spinal nerve will be right there on that model. Mixed, because we have fibers devoted to bringing in sensory information to that dorsal root ganglion, and we have fibers that are sending out motor commands, leaving that ventral horn, the spinal cord. That spinal nerve is going to branch. It has rami. See that word again, a ramus, an arm. So the spinal nerve is going to have arms that branch off of it. The dorsal ramus brings in sensory information and sends out motor commands, all devoted to the skeletal muscles of the neck and the back. So this is all mixed. So the rami are mixed, sensory in, motor out, but devoted to different regions of the body. So devoted to the dorsal ramus, devoted to the back part of the body, basically. And the ventral ramus, sensory information in, motor commands out to the muscles of the body wall and the limbs. But then we also have some other rami communicantes. So this is where we get some branching that's gonna head to the sympathetic division of the nervous system. We're gonna have some other ganglia that are part of the sympathetic nervous system that are lining here as well. The sympathetic chain ganglia, they're all linked together. They are gonna get some sensory and motor fibers coming from the spinal cord via these rami, the white and gray rami. It's gonna connect all the mid spinal nerve to the sympathetic division of the nervous system. We'll see that. Here we go. Let's understand what we're looking at. There's that dorsal root ganglion, cell bodies of neurons who have extensions out in the periphery picking up sensory information. Okay. And there's the dorsal root. And those cell bodies deliver the information along and goes into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. The ventral root. Our fibers are axons of neurons whose cell bodies are in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. They're traveling out of the central nervous system. Where we have the sensory coming in motor going out, we have the spinal nerve, the mixed spinal nerve. The mixed spinal nerve is short, and it quickly branches into the dorsal ramus, sending out sensory fibers and bringing in, motor fibers and bringing in sensory fibers from the back of the body. And we have the ventral ramus. It's doing the same for the front of the body and the limbs. But off of this ventral ramus, we get this connection. This rami communicates that allows communication between the mixed spinal nerve and the sympathetic nervous system. Because we have another region of ganglion here, the sympathetic chain ganglion. And the white and gray rami are traveling as a connection between the mixed spinal nerve and these neurons that are in the sympathetic chain ganglion that is gonna go handle the organs. Sympathetic nervous system, handling the organs. The fight or flight responses that our organs undergo. Like speed up the heart rate, okay? Open up the pupils of the eyes and then light in if we got a bullet in the dark, right? From some kind of animal, whatever, okay? So, here we are. Again, we are at, let's go here. Starting here, this is the dorsal, so there's the dorsal horn, right? Here's the dorsal root ganglion. Sensory information coming in to the cell bodies here at the dorsal root ganglion. That sensory information continues to travel along the dorsal root into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, now we're in the central nervous system. At the ventral horn of the spinal cord, we have cell bodies here. In their nuclei, devoted to motor, skeletal or body muscles, or viscera, organs. Their axons travel out along the ventral root. Where the ventral root and the axons from sensory neurons meet is the mixed spinal nerve. That will branch into the dorsal ramus, carrying motor fibers and sensory fibers to the back, to and from the back, as well as the dorsal ramus, the ventral ramus, doing the same thing from the front of the body. But then we have this region here, the rami communicates, that consists of the gray ramus and the white ramus. Okay? And this is sending out and bringing in sensory information and motor commands to the sympathetic ganglion. So here's the sympathetic ganglion, a whole other set of ganglions, cell bodies of neurons in the periphery. And here, these guys are sending out motor commands to the muscle, smooth muscle of the body. So all this is about motor commands. Disregard any of the sensory. That's why the dorsal isn't highlighted here. It's all about motor commands going out to the body or entering into the sympathetic nervous system to go to the viscera. And then we have the same type of pathway for the sensation coming in. But this connection between the spinal nerve and the sympathetic nervous system is via the gray and white ramus. So here, this is spinal cord. We're talking about motor commands. Motor commands are going to travel out from the ventral root of the spinal cord along the ventral rootlets that come together to form the ventral root, and those are going to head out to the mixed spinal nerve, where then will divide to go handle the body, the back of the body, or the front of the body. Okay. The only thing we don't see here is the rami connecting this to the sympathetic nervous system. Sensory information is coming in from the back of the body and the front of the body, all being delivered to the dorsal root ganglion, where the cell bodies of the neurons whose receptors around the periphery are. That will be delivered into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. We also have these sensory fibers that are coming in from the viscera. Okay, along the fibers of neurons that are in those cell bodies are at the sympathetic ganglia. And that information is brought in to the dorsal root ganglia as well. So that we get information about what's happening at the viscera, the organs delivered into the spinal cord. The same thing here. Sensory coming in, stops at the dorsal root ganglia, heads on into the spinal cord at the dorsal root. And then this is the sympathetic chain ganglia here. Also, these are dorsal roots. We have a whole other set of ganglia, the sympathetic chain ganglia, that runs down the sides of the spinal cord. Sympathetic division of the nervous system, our fight or flight. Okay? That's going to increase metabolism, increase alertness, shuts down, well, you hope it shuts down your urinary tract, okay? So it shuts down all of that, shuts down reproductive, meaning the most, all of the energy to our skeletal muscles, to our heart, okay? Making us alert, increasing our metabolism, getting us ready to do whatever to fight or flee. These are called, also referred to as paravertebrae, okay? Next to the vertebrae. This whole chain of ganglia that are linked together. Okay? So, and they run down the trunk, all the way down the trunk from these different regions, different numbers in the different regions, linked as such, running down the trunk. Again, these are connected to that big spinal nerve. There's a dorsal root ganglion. Here's the big spinal nerve. Here is those rami, the white and gray rami that connect the big spinal nerve to the sympathetic chain ganglion. So, the sympathetic chain ganglia is here. All these linked ganglion running down the body. Model is depicted. These are depicts the sympathetic chain ganglia. The fat green guy has it on there. Gets lots of good stuff. So the neurons that are going to deliver information to the eventually to the sympathetic chain ganglia, their cell bodies are at the lateral horns of the spinal cord. Again, we'll see the branching of the white and gray rami at the mid-spinal nerve that will head to the sympathetic chain ganglia. Those white rami, okay, and the gray rami as well. Heading to the sympathetic chain ganglia in the sympathetic trunk pathway. What's happening here is when we enter the sympathetic trunk ganglia, okay, we'll have a preganglionic fiber coming from the spinal cord, the lateral horn. Its axon will travel, okay, and then along one of those rami, travel through the big spinal nerve, along one of those rami, heading to the sympathetic trunk ganglion. There, it will synapse on a ganglionic neuron. A neuron whose cell body is in that sympathetic chain ganglion. Okay? And then that information can either go up the sympathetic chain ganglion, passed from ganglion to ganglion, or down, depending on where that has to go, where the organ is. Okay? Or it can go through the trunk and not synapse anywhere. So, we're leaving here at the lateral horn. You can have fibers running out through that big spinal nerve, along one of those rami, and go ahead to the synapse onto a neuron in the in the sympathetic chain ganglion. that will either travel up or down. Up or down. Travels up, it goes and innervates a neuron at a sympathetic chain ganglion higher up than where it entered. It can synapse on a neuron here that will then go out and affect some organ, okay, causing it to gear up and get ready for whatever we're about to face as far as the fight or flight. And so there's even other ganglion in the body, collateral ganglion, farther out. So we just have these connections between neurons whose cell bodies are in these ganglion all around the body that are devoted to motor commands of viscera or bringing in sensory information from the viscera. So again, when we're traveling, we'll travel along the right rami, but we also can travel through that gray rami communicantes, okay, and bring in and go into the ventral or the dorsal rami of the spinal nerve, okay, coming in or out and affecting smooth muscles of our viscera. Our organs are made with smooth muscle, except for the heart, that's cardiac muscle, okay? And again, it's the pathway of motor commands leaving, and then they will divide along the rami and go hit up the neurons that are in the sympathetic chain ganglia, which will then send out commands to this organs wherever they are in different parts of the body. And that innervation through the sympathetic nervous system is going to reduce circulation to the skin. We don't need blood going to the skin. We need blood going to our skeletal muscle. Okay, we gotta fight or flight. We flight or fight. Right? Flee or flight. More skeletal circulation to the muscles. More energy is gonna be made at the skeletal muscles. A lot of ATP at the skeletal muscles. Okay? We're gonna release energy from the adipose tissue, release fat, and start burning that. Need this energy because we gotta fight or we have to flee. We're gonna stimulate, innervate the erector pili muscle. You know, when you're about to fight, you might get some goosebumps, right? You get scared, goosebumps. Open up those pupils, let all the light in we can get, especially if it's dark and we need to run. Okay, increase that heart rate. Get that blood pumping. And open up our respiratory tubes, that oxygen in. This is what the sympathetic nervous system is devoted to. Compared to the parasympathetic nervous system. That's devoted to no other nervous system. That's devoted to feed or breathe, your eating, your digestive tract, your reproductive tract, your urinary tract. It all gets overridden on the sympathetic nervous system. Kicks on.